We asked Gene to frame our session this morning due to his long-standing leadership in the health field. He, among many other leadership positions, was the board chair of Grantmakers in Health. He's currently the interim CEO of the Council on Foundations. And because of that, I really do want to take the time to just quickly read to you some of Gene's remarks that he had wanted to share with us this morning. So what Gene had to say was that for 36 years, it was his privilege to work for the Duke Endowment, which is a private foundation in Charlotte. The majority of his time was spent in healthcare, where the foundation supported projects in North and South Carolina. That support went to more than 400 organizations, whose purpose and identity changed over the years as the healthcare needs and resources evolved. Looking back on those years, Gene says that he sees one of the macro challenges the foundation had was how to assist large and strong organizations to use their abilities to discover and innovate, and conversely, to help smaller and weaker communities to obtain the services they really needed for their community. Said another way, he may spend one day where he had a site visit at Duke Medical Center, and then that same day was at a 40-bed rural hospital. Along the way, he said he was very eager to borrow concepts from anybody who had a good idea and bring to the Carolinas safe, high-quality rural hospitals, the nurse-family partnership, which he was instrumental in scaling, volunteer physician networks that were completely focused on safety net providers, and a really innovative social impact bond experiment with the South Carolina Medicaid program. Gene also mentioned that looking back, he can see some common threads, and one of them is the need for digital transformation of healthcare and all the ways that that need was manifested over the years that he worked in this field. The other great need he sees is the continued evolution of one of the ultimate safety net organizations in our community. And this is and it may not be the community hospital, it may be a small health platoon in the community, but a health entity that is completely committed to the health of the community. So this morning, our program will address both of those key themes that Gene had really identified in two separate but connected discussions. So I'd like to, without further ado, introduce now our speakers. First, I want to introduce Matt Vogel, who's the Executive Director for the National Mental Health Innovation Center at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. Matt's center was made possible a few years ago by a generous gift of $10 million by the Anschutz Foundation. This past year, the foundation made another gift of $120 million to the University of Colorado campus for not only translation and discovery, but also to make their campus one where all of the departments work together through partnership and integrate public health and nursing in all of the programs. This brings the sum total of the Anschutz commitment to this campus to $300 million. So Matt Vogel will be introducing Dr. Tom Insel, and he will be coming to the stage with Matt, or he'll be interviewing him today, I should say. And I just want to say just a few words about Tom. Tom is someone I first became aware of when I was a research fellow at the Human Genome Project, and Tom was a rising star scientist at the NIH. He was mentored directly by Dr. Francis Collins. His work on monogamous voles showed us that the science of the cuddling hormone, which I think has made all of our marriages better to learn about. He was revolutionary in establishing a medical model for mental illness, and this finally gave mental health and mental illness a chance to really enter the medical mainstream, and it was just incredibly important work. His recent transition to Silicon Valley is an inspiration to all of us. It's a life that continues to grow and evolve, and I could say a lot more, but for now I just want to bring to the stage Matt Vogel and Tom Insel.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very sweet. Thank you.
Well, I want to start just by thanking you all for allowing us to be here and for taking time on your agenda this year to shine a light on the issue of mental health. And I have known Ted Harms, obviously, for many years, even before he funded our center, and I've heard him talk a lot about the Philanthropy Roundtable. And so being able to have issues that are really important to Tom and I and to many of the people in this room is incredibly important. And so we want to thank you for that. So Anna did, I think, a better job of introducing Tom than I could. But Dr. Insel, who's a psychiatrist, is someone that I've known of for many years, and I'm now thrilled to be able to call you a colleague and friend. Dr. Insel ran the National Institutes of Mental Health, which really oversaw the largest research funding pot of money in the entire world for many years, from 2002 until 2015. But in many ways, I think Tom really became best known for leaving the National Institutes of Mental Health. And I remember vividly when one of the psychiatrists at the Depression Center where I was working came into my office and said, "Did you hear about Tom Insel?" I said, "No, what?" And he said, "He's leaving NIMH to go to Google." And it really did send shockwaves, I think, through academic medicine in many ways. And so Tom went to Google Verily for a while, and then left there to be an entrepreneur and start his own digital health startup, MindStrong Health, which we'll be talking about in a little bit. So please join me in welcoming Tom. Thank you. Yeah. So Tom, I just want to, I dive right into that first issue, that I had just raised. People were excited and I think so intrigued why you would leave the NIMH to go to Google. And I'm curious what the thinking was there, and what was it that you thought you could accomplish by going to work in the Silicon Valley that you weren't able to do in your post at NIMH?
Well, first of all, Matt, delighted to be able to be part of this, and we've had several phone calls back and forth and gotten to know each other. It's that by itself has made this worthwhile for me. So thanks to all of you for being here as well. The transition from public service to the private sector was not something I had ever planned. I had spent most of my life in public service and working in the federal government, which most people think must be really, it's often said, being a bureaucrat, why would anybody do this? It's a fantastic form of service. It's a very pure mission. And you're surrounded by lots of very talented people. And I can tell you they're not there for the money because they don't get paid very well. They're there because they really do want to make a difference. But they also have the opportunity to use an enormous amount of money for good. So in some sense, they attack this mission at the National Institutes of Health, which is the overriding agency that's currently directed by Francis Collins, who had been my colleague at the Genome Institute. But the NIH generally is that part of the federal government that invests in healthcare and research. So it's the R&D on everything from cancer to asthma to early childhood to mental health and addiction. 27 institutes, and many people have said it's sort of the jewel in the crown of the federal government because there are actually very few governments that do this. $38 billion a year of taxpayer money going into trying to find solutions, trying to figure out the fundamental biology of cancer and heart disease and diabetes and brain problems. It'd be wonderful if other nations would agree to something like this, but this has been, we've really had to carry the banner. Now, NIMH, the mental health part of that, had a budget of about $1.5 billion when I was there for those 13 years. And it really was an extraordinary opportunity. And I got there just at the right time. We had the wave of genomics that broke just as I was arriving. 2002, 2003 was the completion of the human genome. And it gave us this blueprint, really, for biology. It also gave us fantastic technology, which has powered so much of what we've been able to do in cancer and in rare diseases and many other parts of medicine. The other thing that was happening at the same time was a revolution in neuroscience, and it allowed us for the first time through better imaging, again, better technology, to see how the brain works in real time. What President Obama, when he announced the Brain Initiative, said, we're trying to develop the tools to look at how the brain works at the speed of thought. And I thought he captured it perfectly. Not only what the goal was, but increasingly what the reality was, that we were able to do this in a way that we couldn't have even really imagined 15, 20 years ago when I was a working scientist. So why would I leave?
Yeah.
It's a pretty good place to be. And a lot of resources to work with and incredible talent. I was giving a talk, I think it was on the West Coast, in a group very much like this, about 3 or 4 years ago. And it was a group that had a lot of family members of people with serious mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar, severe depression. I talked about what we were doing, and I shared the genomics, the epigenetics, the spectacular work with stem cells for autism, how we were, and I had great images of what we could see with the brain and how neuroscience and the Brain Initiative from the president was really changing everything in the way we could think about brain diseases. At the end, someone got up and said, thank you for your presentation, but in all honesty, you just don't get it. And I was a little taken aback. I wasn't sure that I had heard him correctly. And I said, what do you mean? He said, look, he said, I'm a father. I have a 23-year-old son with schizophrenia. He's been in the hospital 5 times, 2 suicide attempts. He's on 6 drugs. He's currently homeless. Our house is on fire, and you're talking about the chemistry of the paint. And I was really stunned. I just don't think I had thought about it in quite that way, with that kind of urgency and that kind of poignancy. And of course, what I said was, science is a marathon. It's not a sprint. You have to know more before you can do more, lots of defensive responses. But I went home and I started thinking about that. And I realized that if I was really honest with myself, I'd been there for 13 years, at that point maybe 12, and I went back and I looked at the slides I had been showing 10 years earlier, and they weren't as nice, but they all ended with the same comment that 10 years from now, everything will be different. And I began to think, how long am I going to continue to tell people that 10 years from now, everything will be different? Because I've been saying it for more than 10 years. And it was at that moment when I thought, maybe there's a better way. And about that time, I am getting to the end of the question. There was a piece by Tom Friedman in the New York Times that really caught my eye. He was quoting an Israeli thought leader named Tom Goodwin, who said, things are really interesting here, that Airbnb, the world's largest provider of accommodation, has no real estate. That Uber, the world's largest provider of transportation, has no cars. Facebook, largest media company, has no content. And although it may be less true now than ever, Alibaba or Amazon, our biggest sources of goods, they have no stores. So we're in a different world. And I began to think that maybe this was the moment for healthcare, not just mental health, but health generally, to have its interesting moment where it was time to think about whether the world that we have built, which was really a world built for providers, for physicians and nurses, a world built to some extent for payers, whether it's time to rethink that world, and you'll hear a lot more about this from David Feinberg in a few minutes, so that it becomes like these other industries, a world built for users, a world built in this case, for patients and families. And what would that begin to look like? And it was about that time when I got a call from Google asking me if I wanted to come and blow up the mental health care system. And that's often the way people think there. And I really knew nothing about that world. Other than watching the series Silicon Valley, which was my introduction, which turns out, by the way, to be a documentary, which I hadn't realized until I got there. But it was pretty foreign, and yet absolutely fascinating. And so within a few months, I packed up and moved to California and started work there. Just one last thing about this. It's hard for most of us who haven't grown up in that world, especially for me. I was like, when I interviewed, I said to them, "Are you sure you want to do this?" Because I looked around and everybody's much younger than my children. And I said, "I'm a grandfather." And the VP who was hiring me said, "Oh, that's fine. We have another one here." So out of 66,000, I was the second grandfather. It's a really fascinating place, though, and I learned very quickly through their orientation, what you do on the first 3 days there, 2 or 3 things. One is that they think differently about scale. So at Google, success is defined as having a product that is used by 1 billion people a day. And until you hit that scale, you're still a work in progress. And they have 7 such products, and every one of them is free, and every one of them makes a ton of money. So besides learning about scale, I learned that the economics of software were really different than the economics that I had ever heard about before. And the third thing they made very clear very quickly was that they're interested in transforming areas of various markets, as they've already done. But the culture with which they do that is incredibly different than any culture I'd ever seen. When you ask people, and they really hammer this into you on the first day that you're there, the culture of Google and of most companies in the Valley is a learning culture. That is that you're always getting feedback. You're always changing what you're doing. And I actually found that obnoxious. But it's almost after every conversation, a true Googler will turn to you and say, "How was that for you? Did you get what you needed?" Sort of bizarre in a way. But you're really trained to always get feedback and then to modify what you make and what you do and how you work based on that feedback. So as somebody said to me, people like to think that this is about hoodies and Teslas and having a lot of disposable income. It's all about feedback. That's what this culture is. And that is not the culture of healthcare. It's really a different world. And that, I think, was one of the first things that stunned me, that in the same way that Amazon and Airbnb and Uber have transformed their industries, what a company like Google, or for that matter, Apple or Microsoft or even Facebook could bring to healthcare could be less the products, less the software or the hardware, and more a different way of doing business, a way of doing business that would invert the power dynamics, would suddenly be looking entirely for what is the patient's experience and how do we build the goods and services that work for patients rather than payers and providers. And that would be a transformation. So sorry for a very long answer.
No, it makes it very easy to interview.
That's pretty much, that was part of the journey.
I think one of the criticisms, and you alluded to this, that has long been levied against academic medicine and the way that research is approached is that it's so incremental and therefore very, very slow. And people, especially patients, get impatient and say, how come we can't move these things along more quickly? On the flip side, one of the big criticisms that is now being leveled against a lot of the tech industry with respect to digital health is that they're moving too quickly, and that As a result, scientific rigor is kind of getting left by the wayside. Do you think that one of those things is more true than the others? And where's the sweet spot?
Yeah, I think they're both true in about the same degree. The mantra in Silicon Valley a decade ago was move fast and break stuff. And that was, maybe that's okay if you're building a piece of software that isn't related to healthcare. I'm not sure you want your physician to be moving fast and breaking stuff, especially in the operating room. There may be a better way. I do think it's very hard for, in the same way it's hard for academic environments to move quickly and to respond with the kind of urgency that the public health demands, I think. In the tech environment, particularly in the big companies, it's very hard for them to understand the needs of healthcare. They don't get regulation, they don't get HIPAA and privacy, they don't understand the sensitivity of a lot of these issues. And on the flip side of that, it was one of the reasons I left Google, or Verily, which was the part of Google that focuses on healthcare that we split off from the main company. I began to feel like there wasn't a public trust in large tech companies to be able to take on healthcare, particularly mental health care. That was going to be a real problem. So in a way, I think the sweet spot for this is in the startup community, or sometimes in the nonprofit community, where you can scale down, you can focus on parts of the problem. And you can do this at a pace that allows for rigor, if you have enough investment, but also it honors the needs for moving quickly enough to get results. People have often asked me, well, what's the difference between being in academia and being in the private sector? And I usually say, it's the verbs more than anything. The verbs are different. So in academia, we study, we investigate, we explore. In the private sector, we solve, we fix, we build. It's just a different culture with a lot greater sense of accountability. And we have to get something. We have a problem we're trying to fix, and either you fix it or you die. The company doesn't survive if you can't solve the problem. And so it's all hands on deck with tremendous focus, ridiculous hours of work, but everybody's getting to that verb to solve.
At our center, we made a decision which is very atypical for a university-based center like ours, to work very closely with industry. And conventional wisdom has long been that if you're too close, it's going to imbue your research and alter your perceptions. But we found that these startups in the Valley were very, very eager to work with universities, but there really hasn't been a good model for that. And how do you see the relationship with universities and industry evolving in this age of digital health, and where does it need to go?
Well, so there is the opportunity. I think we've got, it is almost a perfect marriage, not quite perfect. It's a marriage that needs a little bit of work, needs a good therapist probably. But what the academy can bring is patient care, rigor, a depth of science, and a deep understanding of the problem to be solved. That is because they're engaged in healthcare every day. I'm thinking about a medical center like where you are, Matt. What they lack and what the private sector can do is the whole piece around engineering, design, the ability to scale quickly and to build things. When I say that, like Google believes in scale, at the NIH, our sort of primary funding mechanism was what was called an R01 grant. There are a whole series of R series grants, but the R01, which was our primary grant, which you know well, is a grant that gives you $250,000 a year over 5 years or 4 years. And when I told people that at Google, they just thought that was hilarious. That was just like unthinkable. At Google, if you have a problem you want to solve instead of study, it's $100 million and 100 software engineers. That's where you start. And if it's less than that, it's probably not worth doing. So in the private sectors, there's the ability to bring that army of people together to build stuff and to build it quickly and to iterate and improve it constantly. And that's just much, much harder to do and harder to fund, by the way, in the public sector. The academic timelines are way off for that. But I think you're right, Matt. I think you need both because fundamentally, at least in Silicon Valley, the world of software and hardware is driven by engineers, and they're very good at what they do. They know nothing about clinical medicine. They don't know what's the problem to solve, and often they don't know a lot about human beings either, and so they don't understand what it is that people really want, and especially within a healthcare context. So you need both. But you're right, it's a tough marriage because there are, every university thinks it should have all the IP that gets generated by any private entity. And every private sector group is worried about sharing all of its data in the way that we today expect in the public sector because they're certain they're going to be ripped off by someone else. So they're very often very competitive in that regard. So that's where you need a therapist. You need to find a sweet spot where it can work. Sometimes it also helps to have a third entity, either a clinical environment like Geisinger or someplace where the clinical load is there and the interest in innovation, or a nonprofit environment where this can be done without such a focus on IP.
In this digital health revolution that we're in the midst of, we have everything from Bluetooth connected asthma inhalers to watches that will take your blood pressure for you. And it's exciting because, we're putting a lot of power in patients' hands to, manage and or at least have a more active participation in their own care. But there's a lot of downside to it, too. I think we were talking at dinner last night that there's somewhere in the order of 340,000 mental health apps in the App Store, and might even be more than that. But so what's needed in order to help patients and in order to help philanthropists really sort out what's real, what's hype, and what's going to be truly helpful for people?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, this has been a gold rush, and an enormous number of people in this space. I think you're right. I think. Ivy, the corporate group that looks at these things, said that there are about 340,000 health apps broadly. Probably 60% of those are wellness and fitness, so they're not particularly relevant to clinical medicine in the way that we would think about people with the most severe illnesses, although they're important. But even within that 40%, huge amount of activity here. Nobody can keep up with it. There's something like 200 new health apps every day, 200 new ones. And the numbers are really stunning. It looks like most of this is absolutely noise. I think according to their study, 85% of those apps, so those 340,000, are installed less than 5,000 times. So it's what at Google we would call dog food. It's friends and family. It's not really being used at any scale. There are 41 of them that have been installed more than 10 million times, which is a kind of threshold you'd look for. So that's something. I mean, it's a start. And there's probably a thing in each area of healthcare that has some evidence base behind it. Ironically, it's in the digital mental health space where probably there's the most activity. But it's about 28% of the actual health apps, the ones that are not fitness but for clinical medicine, about 28% are within the mental health area. And there are apps for almost every part of that: diagnostic, therapeutics of various kinds, clinical management, all that. It's really hard to know what's garbage and what's valuable. There is no regulatory environment for this. It's not like medications where we have the FDA. There is no FDA for software. Although the FDA is talking about it and they're doing a pilot to try to figure out how they could regulate it, they were the first ones to say, we can't, I mean, if you're changing your software every 48 hours, how are we going to regulate that? We work with medicines. They take 17 years to develop from the time you have a small molecule to the time we give you approval. We can't deal with something that's changing every 2 days or every 3 days. And so they're struggling with that. They have a proposal. They're actually very thoughtful. I've been impressed by how well they've taken this on. But again, they're way, way, way behind the curve. This thing has left the barn, and I think all of us are trying to figure out, even those of us in the field, where's the evidence, what's hype, what's useful, what's actually going to be something that will have an impact on clinical outcomes. So, two things I'd say. One is that we've got to sort of give ourselves a little bit of time to let this evolve. We're in the first inning of what's probably a 9-inning ball game, and there's a lot of activity, but we don't yet know where the dust is going to settle. The second is that there are attempts to begin to grab this landscape and try to understand it. Brandon Staglin, who's here in the back, and he's going to speak this afternoon, has put together a very interesting effort called Cyber Guide, which is part of a nonprofit effort now based at Northwestern University, which is kind of like a consumer reports guide for the mental health community anyway, to say, look, if you want to find cognitive behavior therapy online or through some app, these are the ones that have been tested in clinical trials. These are the ones where we have the best evidence. And one other thing I would just point out, Matt and I were talking about this last night. He didn't mention this, but he's just back from Shanghai or from China, and I was there about a month ago. Whatever is happening in the United States is like a tiny piece of what's happening in China. We are doing the slow walk. They are really racing forward. So you may want to say a little bit about your experience there, but whether it's for virtual reality or software apps or whatever the next thing is going to be, particularly in healthcare, it looks like our innovation may be coming from there here rather than from here there. But I don't know if you saw that as well.
I saw that very much so. I mean, things that we're just starting to look at as kind of demonstration projects in the United States, they already have implemented and are taking to scale. One of the things that I saw was virtual reality classrooms where they have, they see VR as the evolution of the blackboard. They said we went from, teaching kids using blackboards to overhead projectors to smart boards. And now, I saw these classrooms where all the kids would put on their VR headsets and they would say, okay, we're gonna, look at the human heart and learn about that. And then they would gather around this giant 3D image of the heart, which they could then pull apart and say, okay, here's the, the different components of it and how it works together. Here's what blockage looks like. And I've never seen anything like it. And for them, it's, it's already up and running. And I never would have believed it had I not seen it with my own eyes.
Remarkable. I mean, Alibaba has now decided to get into healthcare. They bought 50 hospitals. They're creating a whole healthcare system called Ali Health. So in this country, as I said, it's been difficult for big tech to get into healthcare for lots of reasons, mostly cultural. So small companies like mine are doing this. In China, it's the big tech companies, Alibaba, Tencent, they have decided this is the place they want to innovate. And they may figure it out because they can leapfrog over us on so many levels. We're still stuck with electronic health records that nobody likes. We're stuck with lots of an installed base that people are unhappy with, but it's hard to get rid of. China doesn't have that. Yeah. And they have enormous resources that they're putting into this. So I think a lot of us at this point are watching very carefully how this plays out in China, where there are not the same concerns around privacy. And they do move fast and sometimes break things, but often get things right as well.
Yeah, we have a lot to learn there. In the short time that we have left, I want to talk just about what's happening with respect to technology in mental health. And, our center is doing a lot in virtual reality. And in fact, we have staff here who are doing demos of VR if people want to see some of what is, just a small taste of what's happening over by the Ponce de Leon ballroom number 4. I encourage you to come and try that out. It's a lot of fun. But tell us a little bit about what you're doing at your startup at Mindstrong and what you think is exciting in the field of mental health right now.
Well, there's a lot of activity at the startup level, and ours, in the same way that you guys are focused on VR, which is spectacular. And really, if you haven't done this before, I'm a bit of a Luddite, and I don't believe in a lot of the tech stuff, but this is cool. This is really an experience. It's very immersive. It's transformative. It's amazing to watch. So you should try it out. We're doing something very different. We're focused on measurement. We had the sense that the absence of biomarkers or objective tests in psychiatry has been a huge problem. So the question is, since we all walk around with these very powerful computers in our pockets, is there a way to understand something about how we think, how we feel, how we behave from data that is on the smartphone? Not what we're typing, but how we're typing. So our company was actually founded by a very smart surgeon who had been one of the leaders in machine learning at the early days of that computer science. He's both a computer scientist and a physician, but he got into cybersecurity, and he figured out a way to use keyboard patterns, how you type, as a digital fingerprint. And he developed a forensic tool for cybersecurity, made a huge amount of money. The company was bought. And then he thought, wow, what am I going to do now? And he thought, I used to be a doctor. Maybe I could use digital fingerprinting for digital phenotyping. So he took the same technology, and that's what we do. It's basically a way of looking at what's happening on your keyboard, and by getting the typing patterns, understanding something about your reaction time, your processing speed, your ability to modulate emotion, and a whole range of other things that with machine learning we've been able to figure out. So it's giving us the first digital biomarkers for mental health, which I think could be really transformative.
Yeah. Tom, I don't think that there's a conversation that I've had with you where I haven't learned 10 new things, and I wish we could have this go longer, but we did just get the Time's Up card, and we were told to take it very seriously. So I just want to thank you for coming in today and just giving us a little bit of insight into what's happening in this world of digital health. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.